Hello and welcome. My name is Frances Billinghurst, and this is a re-recording of a presentation that I made last night, being the 3rd of September, and I thought I'd re-record it so it doesn't actually depict other people who are watching the presentation last night, just in case if they had an objection of being made available, or the images made available to a wider community. So this presentation is about the differences between the Northern and Southern Hemispheres, in particular when it comes to witchcraft. And one of the reasons why I decided to do this presentation is because the majority of our sources, and if it comes to witchcraft, still seem to be very Northern Hemispheric orientated. And as such, they contain little, if any, information or even a true understanding as to how we do things down under, so to speak. So there are quite important differences, and as such, I have done this presentation that I'm just going to pull up. And before we go any further, move myself from the screen, I want to acknowledge country. I acknowledge the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which I reside and on which I am doing this recording. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So, back to the differences between the hemispheres. In order to discuss these, we need to venture into the realm of science, starting with what is referred to as the Coriolis effect. Although recognized previously by other people, the mathematical expression for the Coriolis force appeared in an 1835 paper by a French scientist by the name of Gaston de Coriolis, in connection to the theory on water wheels, of all things. Early in the 20th century, the term Coriolis force began to be used in connection with meteorology. It was seen as a force, for want of a better word, that made things such as planes and wind currents, etc., that travelled in long distances around the Earth to move in a curve as opposed to a straight line. And here's the equator here. The key to the Coriolis force lies in the Earth's rotation. It rotates faster at the equator than at the North Pole or the South Pole. It's also wider at the equator. And this means that to make one rotation in a 24-hour period, the equatorial regions race nearly 1,600 k's per hour, which is about 1,000 miles per hour, while near the poles, the Earth rotates at a sluggish 0.0000808 or 0.00005 miles per hour. One of the important things the Coriolis effect acts on are storm systems, in particular hurricanes, typhoons, which are also known as tropical cyclones. There are low pressure systems as well as trade winds. Cyclones, I just said, are low pressure systems that suck the air into their center, which is the eye, and here's a cyclone here, another one here. And as the air is sucked into these storm systems, they begin to spin. The Coriolis effect will dictate which direction they will spin in. So if we're looking at the Northern Hemisphere, the fluids from the high pressure systems pass low pressure systems to their right, so they're moving this way. As the air masses are pulled into the cyclones from all directions, they are deflected, and the storm system, the hurricane, seems to rotate in an anti-clockwise direction. So it's moving here. See with these purple arrows. In the southern hemisphere, the same thing happens. So the system's still moving to the right, but the currents are deflected, I should say, to the left. And that results in the storm system seeming to rotate in a clockwise direction. The Coriolis effect also helps to determine regular wind patterns. As the warm air rises near the equator and flows towards the poles, in the Northern Hemisphere, these warm air currents are deflected to the right, which is east, as they move northward. The currents descend back towards the ground at about 30 degrees north latitude. And as the current descends, it gradually moves to the northeast, from the northeast, to the southwest and back to the equator. In the southern hemisphere, the opposite happens. The warm air currents are deflected to the left. So they're coming from here and they're moving this way. Which is the west, move southward before descending up towards 30 degrees, which is here, latitude. While the current descends, it gradually moves from the southwest, so here's southwest, to the northeast. So the winds come down and moving up here from this direction, back towards the equator. The consistently circling patterns of these air currents, these air masses, are known as the trade winds. And this pattern of from here and that way, and down and up here, also affects how water moves down drains, how vines wind themselves up poles or trees, and also how energy moves, although some people tend to dispute this. So the next time you catch the weather on television, have a look at the way the wind patterns move in your hemisphere. And I will return to the Coriolis effect in a moment. The most notable distance between the hemispheres is the 6 months difference between the seasons. This is because the Earth is on an axis that is tilted at 23 degrees. So when it's summer in the Northern Hemisphere, it's winter here in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is the reason why some seasonal symbolisms associated with Easter and Christmas in particular are very much out of place here in the Southern Hemisphere. So without taking into account any seasonal shifts or alleged seasonal shifts due to climate change, global warming, etc., and focusing simply on the timing based between the relationship between the Earth and the Sun, it means that the two solstices, summer and winter, regardless of what hemisphere, always happen around the 21st of December or the 21st of June. The two equinoxes always happen around, say, 21st of March or the 21st of September. And then we have the 4 cross-quarter days. So in the Southern Hemisphere, our Lammas or Lunasa happens in early February, while in the Northern Hemisphere, it happens at the end of July or beginning of August. Now, there's one issue that I have with this diagram, in particular the Southern Hemisphere one, is that it seems if you go around the seasons, from midwinter, it's moving to the right, and that's actually the same direction here in the Northern Hemisphere. It really should be, and this is just my little bugbear, moving to the right here as opposed to the left. This is the way our energies move in the Southern Hemisphere, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. I do cover this diagram here to the right is actually in my book, Dancing the Sacred Wheel, which I first published in 2012. And this is largely about the seasons here in the Southern Hemisphere and how we can work with them. I also cover this information in Contemporary Witchcraft and very briefly in a little book of Wicca. And these books are available through Amazon, Book Depository, Booktopia, UDEMY, your local bookstore, etc. So they are available. Some of the resources that I'm making available for the Southern Hemisphere. So now we'll just move on to the direction of the sun. And here we've seen this diagram that's got the axis that the Earth is on, and we can see the tilt is actually quite a really good diagram that I found. The tilt of the Earth's axis also means that while both hemispheres, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, on its journey across the sky, in the Southern Hemisphere, the sun moves via the north. For this reason, most pagans, or many pagans, I should say, in the Southern Hemisphere cast their circles in this direction by the north, or in an anti-clockwise direction, as opposed to by the south or clockwise in the Northern Hemisphere. According to the Australian Concise Oxford Dictionary, the word gisal comes from the Gaelic meaning sunwise, or the direction of the apparent motion of the sun. In Scottish folklore, gisal is considered the most, quote, prosperous course, whereas the word widdershins comes from the Middle High Germanic word meaning against or sense, and also, quotes, in the direction contrary to the apparent course of the sun, end quotes. In Scotland, widdershins was the lowland Scots' favoured word, and in more modern times, these words have been associated with clockwise and anti-clockwise. Again, this is my second bugbear. I prefer to use the terms gisal and widdershins when it comes to circle casting and moving about the circle, as opposed to clockwise and anti-clockwise. Basically because the first watch was invented only in the 18th century, and the first actual written recording of witches moving widdershins can be traced back to 1591 in a Scottish witches' dance that became prominent as a form of the witches' reel during the North Barrack witch trials. Now, this was the first major witchcraft persecution in Scotland and began with the sensational case involving the royal houses of Denmark and Scotland. King James VI sailed to Copenhagen to marry Princess Anne, the sister of Christian IV, the King of Denmark, and on their return to Scotland, they experienced some terrible storms and had to shelter in Norway. Now, during this time, even though nobles of the Scottish court were implicated and charged with high treason, the witch trials that were held in Denmark at this time was when James heard the news that he decided to set up his own tribunal, because there was actually nothing in Scotland at the time. And some of the words of this song, This Witch is Real, that was taken from the witchcraft trial of the Earl of Bothwell, who was one of the people charged with creating the storms that delayed King James's return, claimed that there were witches dancing on the cliff and to stir up the sea so the king couldn't return. And in the words of the song, and if you Google Witch is Real, you'll come up with the words. And one of the verses go, come a go ye before, come a go ye. If ye winna not before, come a let me. Ringa windishins, whirling skirling widishins, dear take her mouse, whatever she be. So we've got this word widishins, which means against the sun. This is what I'm trying to explain here, is that the sun direction, we cast our circles usually in the due south direction, in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere, it is with the sun. The only difference being is that due to the spin of the Earth on its axis, clockwise direction is actually widdershins in the Southern Hemisphere, so we're moving anti-clockwise around our circle. So when you're reading books, or when beginners are reading books written by people residing in the Northern Hemisphere, and the books are saying cast your circle in anti-clockwise direction, sorry, in a clockwise direction, that is not due south for us in the Southern Hemisphere. Our due south is anti-clockwise. And these pictures show a little bit more. As well as the Coriolis effect, here's a vine and moving up the pole, how it's moving. And this diagram in the middle is showing a little bit more, or probably more detail, the circle casting in the Southern Hemisphere compared with the Northern Hemisphere, because we're moving with the sun. The sun's in the north in the Southern Hemisphere, while the sun's in the south in the Northern Hemisphere. Another difference between the hemisphere there, moving on, is the placement of the elements. So when we take this information about the energy flow into consideration, it seems logical for the placements of the elements to be as such. The hottest point of our circle, therefore, is the north in the Southern Hemisphere. So that should be where fire should be placed. And if we're sticking to the pairs, so we've got fire and earth being the two pairs, that would mean that the southernmost place in our circle relates to earth. If you're looking at your environment from a more practical sense, especially where I live, the northerly winds in summer blow straight off the desert. They're extremely hot. Summer is also, so the north is also the placement of the noonday sun. In the south, however, the sun never appears in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is the direction from where the bitter winds arrive from. And we've also got the frozen landmass of Antarctica. Now, when I say that the sun never appears, doesn't mean that if you look to the south, you will never see the sun. It just means in the diagram or the analogy of the sun rising in the east, setting in the west. Its zenith, its highest point is the north. So we don't mention the south at all. Whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the other way around. The sun rises in the east, still sets in the west, but the zenith is to the south. So regardless where we reside, I've just said the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. As the sun moves From the rising to setting via the north, this is the most appropriate direction to place fire. And again, north of Adelaide, where I live, is the Simpson Desert, the fourth largest in Australia. It's okay also if you place your elemental representations, if you use them in various other sections around your circle. I'm actually talking from a more contemporary witchcraft perspective, where we have certain placements. I think at the end of the day, know why you are placing your elements in those directions. As such, I would strongly encourage you to observe your local environment. If you live on the eastern seaboard of Australia, like Sydney, New South Wales, Victoria, you might wish to associate west with air. That's the direction that our wind currents come from, blowing across Australia from the Indian Ocean, and east for water, which is the Tasman or the Pacific Ocean. Alternatively, if you live on the west coast around Perth, west might relate to air, relating to the air currents, while east might relate to earth, the rest of the Australian continent. So there are various options that you can use. Again, as I said, look at your own environment, make sure whatever system you use works for you, because you probably will not find reasoning in a lot of the books that, unless they're written by someone in your local area. Now, the moon. A final difference that is often overlooked is that our waxing and waning crescent moons point in different directions to those in the Northern Hemisphere, which is depicted on our calendars. And here we've got the Northern Hemispheric moons, where they are pointing outwards, the crescents, this full moon in the center. Yet in the Southern Hemisphere, we've got a rather introverted moon, because the crescents are pointing inward. So if we are following a neo-pagan imagery for the triple moon, or the triple moon goddess of the made by the crone, instead of pointing outwards, our symbol actually should be pointing inwards. And then just to throw a spanner into the works, there are times when our moon wants to appear with the waxing being observed lying on its back, so it's closer to the horizon, pointing upwards, and the corresponding waning moon will actually be above her, pointing down. And the reason for this is depending on where we are on the earth and how we view the moon. So it's really quite simple explanation as to why our moon in the Southern Hemisphere actually appears a different way. Now, there's a reason, or something that comes up a lot on social media, especially from new beginners, is that they hear from other sources, in particular people from the Northern Hemisphere, talking about names for them full moons. You may have heard of pink moon, storm moon, wolf moon, dryad moon, worm moon, etc. These names actually come from various sources. The more common ones seem to be American folkloric, which also have a healthy dose of Native American. In particular, I think there's a few tribes that have been sort of included. There's also groupings within the Celtic cultures, and I think the Chinese also had names for their moons. In the Southern Hemisphere, it's a little bit different from as far as I have been able to find out. For the Maori of New Zealand, they actually had specific names for the moon every night. And this was because the moon guided the people as to when it was a good time to dig roots, eat certain vegetables or go hunting or gathering. So the moon was used as a guide. Here in Australia, it's different yet again. Now, if we look at this map that I've got here, this shows all the different Aboriginal language groups here in Australia, and there are a lot of them. And this is important to sort of keep in mind, because every single one of these language groups have specific Dreamtime stories, seasonal observances, totem animals, magic, folklore, unique to them. Some areas, like especially in, say, South Australia, around the Coorong, there's a few groups of people there, a few countries where they have very similar folklore, or I suppose mythos, whatever the appropriate word is. But it also means that, unlike what was seen from America or what's coming through on social media, there is no one size fits all. Even on a sort of more wider known stories, so if we're looking at Rainbow Serpent or Dreamtime stories, a lot of these countries, these language groups, these family clans have differences in the story, especially from the Arnhem Land will be different to Cape York. Cape York will be different to what's happening in Tasmania, etc. And also from my personal research, and I'm not an expert in this field, I have only found Aboriginal Indigenous peoples referencing the seasonal changes and not the moon or lunar changes. They do have folklore and stories about the moon, whether it's a boomerang, which sort of gives an indication to the changing shape, or it's someone being punished or ghosts appearing to eat the moon or things like that. But they didn't actually, or what has been published, made available, doesn't tend to reflect what we may be more familiar with from coming from North America. So there are no equivalent Aboriginal moon names as far as I am aware of. And if this is incorrect, and someone who's watching this, if you've actually found some information, please put a comment below, because I am very interested in this topic. So what I have discovered, and what I talk about a little bit in Dancing the Sacred Wheel, are the seasonal names, because different parts of Australia had different seasons, whether it was 2 seasons, 4 seasons, 6 seasons, 8 seasons or more. Some of them only lasted a couple of weeks, some of them lasted longer. And not all information or groups have been studied extensively. There's been a lot of, or a fair bit of information made available and studied from Arnhem in Darwin, and the Nurundjeri people south of Adelaide, which is on the Coorong mouth here. And there's also been a few studies made around Central Australia and also on the East Coast. Where I live, the Kaurna people were almost wiped out when the country was colonialised due to white man's illnesses and diseases coming down the river. But it's happy to say that when I'm at the present time when I'm recording this, there's been a lot of research and putting together their culture again, so that it's improving, which is fantastic. So hopefully we'll be in a position in a number of years to see a more vibrant, very rich culture coming from the Kaurna people, and also the more aware that everybody is of their struggles or of their culture and paying respect, etc. So I'm getting a little bit off track. So when it comes to the moons, what do we do in the Southern Hemisphere? I have seen some people try and do what we did with the seasons and the Sabbaths, moving the dates or the moon names 6 months around. One example of that is in one North American association with the moons, the March moon is known as worm moon due to the worm castings that can be seen on the top of the soil because we're coming into spring. So 6 months from March, of course, is September. And I've seen on social media that some people have referred to the September full moon as worm moon. Now, I personally have a slight issue with that because where I live, September, you don't see worm castings at all. It's probably a little bit late. So I think since this is sort of a new area, it is very important, at least I think it's important, for you to get outside and making observances in your local environment, see what the native trees, the native animals are doing, or other things that make more of an impression to you. Some of these, like for example, and I mentioned this in my next book, which I'm still in the process of proofreading, so it'll be a while before that's available yet. In that, especially from where I live, say March is usually the time of the grape harvest with the grape growing areas close by. Now, I do acknowledge that grape harvest is depending on the level of the sugar level in the crop. So it can actually appear earlier or later, but February is usually a good indication that the grapes are being harvested. So as such, I still call the March moon a harvest moon. It also coincides very nicely with the autumn equinox, which is the Sabbath relating to the harvest, and in particular the ecstatic natures of the gods Dionysus and Bacchus. So it all sort of ties in really nicely there. In, say, August, this is a time when the magpies start breeding, and in particular, we get reports of the vicious attacks, and I think they're usually by the male magpies swooping down and attacking people. So as an example, in one of the circles I was running, I asked people to put together what names they want to be used for the moons, and either August or September was Swooping Terror Moon, and that related to the magpies swooping down and attacking you as you innocently walk down a footpath underneath their nests. Likewise, south of Adelaide in August, we get the appearance of the almond blossoms around Wollonga and that area, and there's usually, pre-COVID, a festival called Almond Festival. And so an alternative for August moon could be almond blossom moon, similar to the cherry moons in Japan. And while not a native, there's a number of streets in Adelaide that are lined with the jacaranda, and these streets are sort of have this beautiful lilac glow of the jacaranda flower in November, with the flowers often covering the ground, and it's very, very beautiful. So to me, the November is jacaranda moon. You might want to acknowledge when, say, kangaroos and the joeys are more active, or when the, say, around June, July, we get the whale sightings here of the southern right whales playing in our warmer waters around Victor Harbour. February to me is usually bushfire moon, because that marks our bushfire season, or the hottest time of the year. And so we can look at various instances, what's happening to us, to get a good name for a moon if this is what you wish to call the moons, as opposed to using the Northern Hemispheric moons. So we're coming to the end, and just some exercises that I think would be of benefit. Start keeping notes of your observances throughout the changing seasons. If you have a garden, you may want to focus on one tree, or it might be a local park near you. Focus on a tree or a plant, or a plant in someone else's garden. How do these seasonal changes affect the local plant or bird life, insects, and even your own mood? One place I used to live in, it was interesting to notice the different birds that would feed off the flowers and the fruits of the tree throughout the year. Second task, explore the 4 elements and their associations with respect to your own environment. We've seen how many Aboriginal language groups there are in Australia. I think there's over 300. Australia is a huge country. We're the same size as the USA. We have so many little microclimates. Even here in Adelaide, I'm in the north, and the weather can be completely different to people who live south of me, or even to the east of me. So what direction would you align the elements to, and with for what reason? I think that's important. As I said, as long as these things mean something to you, there's no one size fits all. And I think unless you are following a tradition, such as I do, if you are a solitary, then you don't need to follow someone else's guidance. I think it's just getting the courage, the encouragement to follow your own thing. And the best way to do that is if you know why you place your elements in certain directions. That's if you use elements in your circle casting at all, then that is perfectly fine. If you're following a tradition, it's a little bit different. And the last question is, have you paid attention to the moon lately? Did you realize it appears in the Southern Hemispheric skies differently to the Northern skies? How do you feel with the ebbing and the flowing of the moon? And the final point that I want to mention, and this sort of ties in with what I've been talking about in relation to establishing a connection with the land. And that is the Aboriginal concept of DADIRRI. And this is an Aboriginal word, or derived from Aboriginal teachings, that means inner, deep listening, quiet, still awareness. And as you can see, various Aboriginal groups use or have a similar meaning to what DADIRRI actually means. And it's all very similar. It's listening, hearing, feeling. So from a contemporary witchcraft perspective, when we connect with the land upon which we reside, we can see and feel a spiritual connection that forms the underlying basis to the fertility element, which originally formed the basis of contemporary witchcraft. Now, when I say fertility, I'm not necessarily mentioning about going forth and multiplying, having babies, etc. There's more to fertility than just that literal sense. While some seasons may appear at different times, and indeed even appear different to those in our Northern Hemispheric counterparts, the mystical sense of space that the Aboriginal people resonate with can still be felt, albeit in a different way. And to quote Dr. Miriam Rose, when I experienced DADIRRI, I am made whole again. I can sit on the riverbank or walk through the trees. Even if someone is close to me has passed away, I can find my peace in the silent awareness. There is no need for words. A big part of DADIRRI is listening. And we're not listening even to another person. We are listening to the earth, to the trees, to the plants, to the land. Through the years, we have listened to our stories. They have told and sung over. They are told and sung over and over as the seasons go by. Today we still gather around the campfires, and together we hear the sacred stories. And especially within contemporary witchcraft, we also have our sacred stories, our mythos. And it's going within. It's not seeing everything on a face value as our society deems us or encourages us to do, especially with social media and Instagram. Everything's superficial. Everything's only on a face value. To truly walk the path of a witch, you need to move beyond that. We still need to maintain connection with the land around us, as well as the symbolism found within the trees and animals locally, as well as from our originating tradition. While doing so, and in doing so, while some can be replaced and used as substitutes, the more we connect with our own land, the more we realize that magic, which is contained, actually lies within. DADIRRI. And these are some of the things where you can find me. Bring my photo back up again. I have a writer's blog, which isn't very active at the moment. I'm on Facebook. Please try and use my author page. Temple of the Dark Moon also has a presence on the web page, also on Facebook. Lunar Noir Creations is where I do my beading work through, which the sale helps me pay for proofreaders and cover designers for the books. And as with this video, I also have a YouTube channel. So I hope that's been of interest. As I did mention, if you have been studying or researching, in particular, Aboriginal connections with the moon, and you are able to share some resources in relation to that, I'll be very much interested in learning more about that. Or if you've got books in particular, or websites or contacts as to who to approach, that would be wonderful. If you are a beginner, I hope you've been able to gain some insight, some confidence to venture out a little bit more and put some of this into your own practice. If you're from the Northern Hemisphere, and this is one thing that I've always remained rather curious about, as I said, Australia is the same size as the USA, yet going by what is produced, and I'm just looking at general publishers, when we're talking about the Sabbaths, the seasons, there hasn't been many books that offer an alternative to the traditional wheel of the year that was basically formed back in the late 50s, early 60s by Gardner and Ross Nichols with their 8 Sabbaths, 8 seasonal festivals. So it's always struck me as to a little bit unusual why no one in America, especially if you're living down south, surely your seasonal representations in the year will be a little bit different. Again, if you have been exploring your connection with the land, I would be interested in hearing your observances. And also, I suppose another task is to find out who were or are the custodians of the land upon which you reside. And that helps, again, a connection between yourself and the land, and knowing how the people, the original custodians, the original inhabitants worked with the land. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please, as I said, put comments below, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time. Blessings.